I'm honored to introduce our final speakers. Before I do, I'd ask you to consider two questions. Did anything you learned today change your perspective at all? Are you going to do anything different tomorrow? If not, then I have faith that our closing speakers are the right two people to help you answer those questions with a firm yes. First, John Carlin. John Carlin recently returned to private practice at Paul Weiss as co-head of the firm's cybersecurity and data protection practice after serving as part of the leadership team of the Department of Justice. John served as a top-level official in both Republican and Democratic administrations, including as the acting Deputy Attorney General of the U.S., the top national security official for the DOJ, the Chief of Staff of the FBI, and as an experienced AUSA. John is also the founding chair of Aspen Institute's Cybersecurity and Technology Program, and has now been named the Strategic Advisor and Chair Emeritus for Cybersecurity for Aspen Digital. And second, Kemba Walden. Kevin Walden is the Principal Deputy National Cyber Director in the Office of the National Cyber Director. Previously, she served as Assistant General Counsel in Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit, responsible for launching and leading the DCU's ransomware program. Prior to Microsoft, Kemba spent a decade in the government service at the Department of Homeland Security, most recently as a cybersecurity attorney for the newly created Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and its predecessor. Kemba was appointed to the National Cyber Safety Review Board and also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University in the School of Continuing Studies. And now, if everyone would join me in welcoming Kemba and John. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And maybe we could start, Kemba, a little bit with you're in a new position and a new acronym for the government, because we need more acronyms. But it's about the 1-year anniversary. Happy anniversary.
Thank you.
But could you describe a little bit? It went from one person in an office, I think, to getting funding to what is it today?
So let me give you a little bit of background. ONCD, the Office of the National Cyber Director, was created by statute in January of 2021. Chris Inglis is the director, was nominated by President Biden in April. He was confirmed by the Senate in June. In July, he walked into the White House. But it wasn't until November of 2021 that we were appropriated. So the first full-time employee came on in December. So by all counts, this is pretty much our birthday. We've been operating for about a year and building the plane at the same time. We are at...
Luckily, not a lot going on in cyber during that time.
Exactly. Yeah. We've been sprinting a marathon. We've been doing quite a bit. So we have somewhere close to 70 employees now, which gets us to initial operating capacity. For a White House office that is large, particularly in policy and strategy. For an operational mission that is very small, meaning that we really don't have an operational mission in this space. We have a tiny one to the extent that we do. When we hope to get to full operating capacity early next year.
What does that look like? How big would that be?
So I think that'll be around 100 people. And that's what we need to be able to execute our strategic intent. So we have 4 outcomes that we're seeking to drive. Federal cohesion, so that not everybody has to have a PhD in order to operate in this space or understand how the space operates. We weren't created in a vacuum. Clearly, there's a lot of cyber to go around, and you were there when we got stood up. There's plenty to do.
That's for sure.
And one of the things that we've done in our office to sort of demonstrate how we're thinking about federal cohesion is to dual hat Chris DeRusha, who's the federal CISO in the Office of Management and Budget. But he is also the Deputy National Cyber Director for Federal Cybersecurity in the Office of National Cyber Director, so that he is able to, we don't compete, right, in that space. So there's no confusion, there's no competition between OMB and their roles and responsibilities and federal executive civilian
OMB,
branch.
that's the Office of
Management
and Budget. Yeah. And a question, I mean, sometimes this post was referred to, and when it was the debate about it in the Hill, as the cyber czar.
Yeah.
What do you think of being called a czar? What does that make you, principal, deputy czar? How does that work?
Well, I think that's lovely to be considered a czar, but that is not what I do. We really think about the strategic investments necessary to achieve our North Star in cyber. And by our North Star, I mean the cyber community's North Star, which for me, no matter whether I'm in the Office of National Cyber Director or in a nonprofit or at Microsoft or have any of the other positions I've had, it's really to make sure that communities are able to thrive and prosper in this interconnected world, full stop. So we are here to help drive the cybersecurity strategic investments to enable that. Cybersecurity is a means to that end. So we don't do cybersecurity just for the sake of cybersecurity. We really do it to make sure that communities, individuals, businesses, academia are able to thrive and prosper. It is a national security issue that we are here to resolve, but it's also one of economic opportunity.
And some will say you're too small, but some will say, what do we need another 100 bodies for, and yet another department or agency and acronym in government? We have so many already. Isn't the problem that no one's in charge? Are you in charge? Who's responsible ultimately to making sure that everyone rows in the same direction?
You know what, this is not going to be a satisfying answer, but we're all in charge of cyber. We all have a role to play. And I know that I'm not as silver-tongued as some, but the visual I like to give is, what's the purpose of the cartilage you have in your body? One sees it, it's not necessarily the most important thing by anybody's imagination, but it really is. It rationalizes how your fingers operate with your wrist, with your elbow, with your arm. Think of us as that connective tissue, right? We're here to rationalize what we have. We're here to make sure that we have appropriate roles and responsibilities, appropriate accountability and responsibility. Cyberspace is really thought of, and from my perspective, as three pieces, right? The technology that we all know and love. We have the CIA triad, think about software and hardware and security. But we have people in cyberspace. People develop cyberspace, people use cyberspace. We're not under it, beside it, we're in it. But then we have the roles and responsibilities, the doctrine, the process. How do we think about who's responsible for cyberspace, who's accountable for cyberspace? Because if we're not guarding the gates at that level, transgressors will walk right through. It's the easiest thing to do. It is certainly much easier than coming up with a 0 day at that technology level. And so all of us have a role to play in cyber. I know it sounds like a slogan, but it's truly how we think about strategic investment. How do we think about who's responsible and who's accountable? I am, as well as anybody else in the government, as well as anybody that uses cyberspace.
Well, let me ask about that investment then. I have a daughter. She's encouraged to use digital platforms at school. She's required, in fact, to use digital platforms at school to be on the internet, but she's not taught cybersecurity as part of the curriculum. If everybody's involved, what's your strategy about reaching kids in the schoolroom, people in college, people at different stages of life?
I'm so glad you asked that, because this is an area that I'm passionate about. This is an area that our office is passionate about. So we are working right now on a national cybersecurity workforce and education strategy, really trying to take a holistic view of this. You might have heard from Camille Stewart-Gloucester, our Deputy National Cyber Director for Tech and Ecosystem, talk about this in a bit of detail. But essentially what it is, it's an opportunity to take a look at and figure out what our strategic investments are to raise education and awareness of the K through 12 system, those that use cyber, those that use the internet, to figure out how to make these spaces cyber safe, and then also to fill the pipeline for those professions that implicate cyber, and more importantly for those jobs that have the word cyber IT in them. But it really starts at that elementary school space. I have children too, and it keeps me awake at night that my daughter could literally start a national security incident, just like your kids could if they click on the wrong thing in our home computer. So she's unique with the cybersecurity education.
All right, what's 3 tips? What should people do at home to make sure that they're educated in this space? Is there a book they should read? Is there what are the Kemba tips that you've been giving on how to be secure?
And I can't endorse any particular tool, but on the technology side, have a a key for your password, a password key, right? So have multi-factor authentication, have random, completely created passwords. But I use a password key lock. I can't remember what it's called, the technology is called, but I use that on my systems. I use a VPN, but there are lots of basic cyber hygiene tools you can use. My children know what a VPN is. They know what a password is. They understand how it works. They understand that if they're going to have technology in our home, that they have a responsibility. There we go again with the responsibility and accountability for safety, right? It is just like in our homes, right? It is my responsibility to make sure that the alarm is turned on, that the locks are locked. But it's my children's responsibility not to unlock the door when a stranger comes, not to turn off the alarm, right? Not to play with the knives. It's my responsibility to make sure those things are up high. We all have a place in this security space, and so our kids really need to understand that. And we're working on opportunities for curriculum development for schools. We're looking at leveraging or finding best practices. We visited a space today called Tech First, I believe, that delivers technology to those underserved communities that were hit with COVID, and they were online, but they didn't have the resources. They have hotspots now. We really talked to them about delivering that technology with cyber safety in mind, and really baking that in. But we need to start there.
And you also talked about development. Question on that for you. I've had the opportunity to work with you in many different hats over the years at Department of Homeland Security, when you were at Microsoft now, and you've had an illustrious career in this space. But how'd you get into this field in the first place?
Yeah, it's a circuitous story. So I went to law school at some point, but before I became a lawyer, I went and lived overseas to do international development work. I was really interested in that North Star, making sure that communities thrive. And I did that in Tbilisi, Georgia, and sub-Saharan Africa, and some through the Caribbean and Haiti. And I recognized that development really didn't take place without a sense of security and safety. And that's not a technology concept, that's just a reality in communities. When I went to law school, my purpose wasn't necessarily to get into cyber. It was to continue that work, but to scale it at a macro level. As I was practicing law, though, I found that I sort of took a left turn and started working on CFIUS and export control. CFIUS is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, looking at national security concerns with foreign investment in U.S. companies, the cases that were the most interesting to me. And I think we were on CFIUS or around CFIUS at the same time.
That was interesting for those who aren't tracking, because it reviews foreign investment for national security risk, and that used to be missile technology, and then it got broadened post 9/11 to look at port security and terrorism.
Wind farms.
How did it go from that to, according to public reporting, blocking a transaction to buy Grindr, a dating app?
Right. Well, some of the most sensitive technology that we have has everything to do with cybersecurity and cyber safety. It's digital technology. We're in a digital ecosystem right now. Some would call it a digital revolution. So there is some sensitive technology out there that, if not mitigated, the national security risks associated with those investments aren't mitigated, could cause some significant consequence, right? So that's what drew me into cybersecurity. Those were the most interesting, consequential cases. I did not work on Grindr, I can say that out loud. But those were the most interesting, compelling cases for really trying to figure out how to measure that risk, how to mitigate that risk, and then what do you do with that residual risk? That's how I started my cyber career. So after doing that, after providing legal services, not only in private sector, but in the government to, at the time, Secretary Johnson, and Deputy Secretary at the time, Deputy Secretary Mayorkas, I went to work for the agency that was the predecessor to CISA as an attorney, and really focused and honed my cybersecurity skills there. So I don't have a technical background. I have a policy degree, I have a law degree. I am not afraid of technology. Anybody in my office that is an engineer would tell you that I'm perfectly happy shoulder surfing and asking all the dumb questions, but I need to understand it because I have an opportunity to shape policy in this space.
It's a critically important point now, I think, when you think of the issue of board oversight. I remember back after one of the biggest hacks ever was on a database that had the personnel records of every U.S. government employee. In fact, my daughter's first piece of mail was linked to that breach, and it was a notice that her identity had been compromised, and she was like one, so it wasn't a big issue for her then. But I remember the President Obama had to try twice to convene the cabinet because the first time everybody sent their cyber expert and didn't come, and then the second time they had to say, hey, I don't care who you bring with you, but you need to have at least enough of an understanding of this in terms you understand about risk in order to make rational decisions. Imagine you're still confronting that now, and in your current role, how do you bring in the non-cyber people to be part of the cyber strategy?
So that's a great question to ask, because that brings us right back to that accountability space, that responsibility space. So we have, at ONCD, we leverage our convening power of the White House to bring in the C-suite, the CEOs preferably, of different industries, to have them talk to each other, to talk with their sector, what we call sector risk management agencies. So the deputy secretary level or the CISO level person, to have a conversation. Frankly, we start with a threat briefing to sort of get them to understand this is a business risk because this is what's happening in your sector. We've done that in health, done that in finance, we've done that in electrical vehicles, we've done a number of things like that. And then we have a conversation about vulnerabilities and mitigating those vulnerabilities and the impacts that could come from that. But it's really bringing the C-suite in and making them understand or helping them come to the conclusion, oh, this is my problem. This is not the IT guy's problem. This is not the CISO shop's problem. This is a business risk. I need to start thinking about capital expenditures. I'm implicated in cyber, right? I need to put this on the CapEx side of the balance sheet, not the OpEx side of the balance sheet. This is a capital investment I need to make in order to reduce that business risk. Cybersecurity is not just about national security, it's also about economic opportunity. The two go together in cyber.
And you mentioned certain sectors, and I'm imagining the CEOs that you're having in are fairly large companies.
Yeah.
What do you do? There's so many, particularly with the scourge of ransomware, as we heard earlier, but so many of the targets now are small or medium-sized company, and if you're talking about making communities thrive, those are often the businesses you depend on day in, day out. What's realistic in terms of them spending capital in this area, understanding it, and how do you approach that strategically?
So there are a couple of things. You'll see in our national cyber strategy whenever that comes out. I'm not committing to anything, but we're
You heard it here. It's coming out next week. Is that what you just said?
No, not exactly. But we're really thinking about strategically what do we need to do to lift and shift risk. Risk right now is borne by those small and medium businesses, by local municipalities and towns, communities. How do we shift the burden of risk to those enterprises, those larger enterprises that can buy them down? And I'm including the federal government in that sort of space. Buy down that risk. And then what do we do with the residual risk? So we need a robust proposition for protecting what we have and buying down the risk, meaning everybody has to participate in that security piece. But then we have the residual risk. What do we do there? We figure out how to make that piece resilient in the people, the technology, and the process. For small and medium businesses and for state and locals, you didn't mention that, but I know that that's what you meant in there, but for local cities, towns, communities, starting with the basics. I had a really great conversation today with the city's CISO that really helped me understand that, NIST standards are great and they're helpful, but they're not necessarily easily ingestible at that local level, at the small business level. So there are a couple of things to do. One, DHS, hopefully Iranga in the last panel mentioned it, but DHS has cyber performance goals that are really outcome driven, that are really those first steps to creating a plan or a cyber hygiene program. That's something practical that communities can use. On our end, it's how do we deliver services in a shared space to be able to allow small businesses, entities to be, so for example, our procurement power, perhaps we've displayed this in 14028, Executive Order 14028, use our procurement power as the large enterprises to drive cybersecurity practices.
Pause 1 second, explain that executive order for folks.
So Executive Order 14028 was created by the president in order to drive certain basic cybersecurity hygiene in our federal civilian executive branch agencies. So think of non-DoD agencies, right? There's a corollary for that side. But it requires simple things like zero trust simple in my mind, but maybe not for a small business, but zero trust architecture, logging, multi-factor authentication, those basic steps to cyber hygiene. So if we're going to begin to provide assistance to small and locals or other entities, we really need to get our own house in order, and that's what that executive order has been able to help us accomplish. It's been, in my mind, successful just for raising awareness. And I know that there are some municipalities that are using it in their space as well.
And there's some concern, I know, about the cyber strategy, and there's a debate, I imagine, about carrots versus sticks. And you talked about risk and who owns the risk. So I'm the dry cleaner, or run a small school. I'm using software that I did not design. Who bears that risk? And are you going to mandate that I use some of those protocols? Do I have to use zero trust, or I'm going to be penalized? Is it just going to be encouraged? What do you think the best approach is?
I really do think right now it's that dry cleaner that bears most of that risk for the software developer that didn't take security into consideration when they design the software. So there are a few things. One, we can rely on market forces to enable the software designers or the cloud service provider, whatever it is, to bake security in their design so that the end user doesn't have to figure out what logging is and how to turn it on. So we allow market forces to do that, but I think in some cases, market forces aren't really evolving enough for us. Regulation might be possible and necessary in this space to cause those service providers, that integration piece, whatever it is, to bake security in by design, whatever it is that they're delivering to local businesses or end users. But we're really focused on what are those investments? How do we shift, for example, how do we use insurance, cyber insurance for those purposes? How do we really provide incentives? And I like to focus on incentives more than the punitive measures, but how do we provide incentives for baking in security by design? So think about it. I don't know, when I had kids, I had to give up my little red car, which was fantastic, and the little stick shift, I'm sure it was secure. But I went and bought a car that I know has a reputation for security, because I did not want to buy a car the way you have to buy software today, which is, you go and you buy the car, and then you have to go and get the add-on for the security features. The airbag is an add-on, the seat belt's an add-on, the anti-lock brakes are an add-on. I mean, imagine if we had a system like that. That's kind of what we have right now. Mm-hmm. Right now, though, I can buy a car, and I know all the security features are in there. My responsibility is to buckle the car and put the child seat in the back seat properly and not text and drive. We want to get to that level of security by design in our technology and hardware in order to be able to shift that risk from small business owners and end users to those that can buy it down. And so that way those communities can focus on the prosperity and the things that we expect the internet to deliver for them.
Let's open it up for questions and get the lights on for it. But I'll ask a question as they're getting that ready logistically. It's interesting that you use that analogy, because of course the cars and the vehicles may be one of the most famous spaces where it was a very heavy regulatory approach that led first to the seatbelt, right? As something that was required by federal government regulation. Is that's an intentional analogy? And here, who the manufacturer then would be the software developer?
So you've sort of picked out my little secret message in there. You're the first person that actually articulated that out loud. But yes, cars are heavily regulated. Their funding for highways were linked specifically to states requiring seatbelts, right? So that's how that happened. But we need to get to that space when we start thinking about cyber. So it's not just the software developers, it's the hardware, it's the integrators, which is a really important element in this space. It's the whole chain. It's from development all the way through to the consumer end product, right? There's a responsibility along the whole chain.
And if you had that regime, we both sat on what was supposed to be a cyber version of a safety review board, but it didn't really have the same authorities as the version for vehicles.
Yeah.
Is the strategy going to come up with a more elaborate architecture of regulation in the space? This would be a significant change.
Well, this is the strategy, so it doesn't. It's how we intend to invest in order to cause change, right? It doesn't come out and all of a sudden we have regulations, right? There's going to be an implementation plan and other pieces that have to take place. But it does talk about what investments are we going to make that where we have demonstrated good practices, like the CSRB, like the JCDC, like the NSA, CECC, like FBI's activity. Those are the strategic. We're going to make bets, and that's going to be placed in our strategy. I see a hand up. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I see that we're out of time, but I would love to answer a question.
Let's do 2 questions.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to inquire about how your office is thinking in regards to, so you mentioned like the national education, program. You mentioned how you guys are going to collaborate and kind of be the connective tissue. How are you all thinking about partnering with the venture capital space to kind of plug in where there are gaps in technology and just pieces of innovation that could be useful for us down the line that maybe venture capitalists themselves are not directly considering, but like how are you guys considering maybe signaling to them to pick up on certain things that you all are seeing in the private sector?
I'm going to do a quick recap of the question, which is, what's the role for venture capital? How could they incentivize?
So as we develop emerging technology, the woman that you saw earlier today speaking about cyber workforce is also responsible for our strategic thinking in emerging technology. We need to be able to invest in opportunities for building security at the beginning, right? So think of things like quantum AI, machine learning. Security needs to be built into the process. But I want to point out, while that is an important space, the venture capital space for investing in emerging technology, cybersecurity, like I said, there are vulnerabilities that we need to think about. Security we need to think about in the people and the process layer as well, right? So I've heard people say before, and I'm almost there with them, that cybersecurity is really a people problem, a people issue, not exclusively a technology issue. And so we have to figure out what our strategic investments are in those spaces, probably as much as, if not more than, what technology we need to invest in, right? Because technology is not going to get us all the way to solving the problem.
Well, thank you. I think we're out of time, but thank you for not just speaking with us today, but your long career in this space. I know I, for one, am glad to see you, someone with your energy and dynamism in your current position. So please just give you a round of applause, and thank you, Kemba.
Guess what, everybody? Thank you so much, John and Kemba. That was wonderful. That was our last session. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for your engagement, your great questions, for being here. This concludes our session. And please follow us. Well, I was going to say follow us on Twitter, but sign up for our mailing list. You're going to see that in a minute. And have a good night, everybody. Thank you so much.